So many of us like to talk about how we peaked in our 20s and we want to get back to this glory day that we lived in. But here's the reality. Most of our perceptions of where we were is off, it's skewed, and most of it's downright wrong. Unless you were an elite athlete, and I mean like the top 5% of all the athletes, then the chances of you peaking athletically and peaking physically is pretty low. And the reality is even most collegiate athletes have a lot still to give. There's farther they can go. But the reality of the matter is it was easier then. Your body was more durable. You could eat shitty food, you could party, you could work out less consistently, although a lot of us worked out very consistently. You could be poor with your diet. You would still get where you need to go. But that doesn't occur anymore. The benefit of being older is now you understand that the process takes time. The things you need to do are progressive and they're not instantaneous, or at least I hope you understand that. And we have a longer timeline to develop ourselves. So with context here, we're speaking about people that want to be adult athletes, whether that's a recreational lifter, a competitive lifter, you want to run marathons or ultras. You can probably go farther than you thought. Now, in some sports, you do peak at a really young age. Now, this could be due to injuries, or this could be due to power output, this could be due to different things. But a lot of people are able to peak much later in life. A lot of strength athletes peak later in life. A lot of endurance athletes peak later in life. We're gonna break down here what you need to do in order to be elite in 30, 40, 50, 60. Now, even if you don't wanna be elite, just being the best version of yourself. A lot of this is going to come from a context of busy people, busy professionals, business owners, doctors, lawyers, anybody with a crazy schedule, family at home. So we're gonna talk about what we need to do to make sure we get there, and we're gonna break it down. I'll try and be as efficient as possible with this video. So some topics I will skim over, but I will make more in-depth stuff on later videos. We're gonna start with nutrition and just make it really easy. When you were younger, most likely if you were at all into lifting in your early or mid-20s, or you're a collegiate athlete, the one thing you heard about is your calories and your protein are probably the two things that came into play. Now, as we get older, when we look at our calories is really simply going to define our body weight. Now, the calories in, calories out gets so much pushback, but that is the reality of the matter. The reality of the matter is if you eat more than you burn, you will gain weight. If you eat less than you burn, you will lose weight. Now, establishing how many calories you burn on a daily basis, that's gonna vary for everybody, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes into play. If you've got a fast metabolism and or you do a lot more stuff, you can handle more food and therefore not gain weight. And vice versa is true, of course. But for calories, it's how many calories you eat is going to dictate that. The key here is to be very cognizant of what you're putting into your body from that point of view. The next is macronutrients. Macronutrients is our fat, carbohydrates, protein, and water. The breakdown of this is going to affect our body composition. So when we look at that breakdown, if we just eat 3,000 calories and we burn 3,000 calories, we won't really gain any weight. But if all we're eating is fat and carbs, we won't have the tools for our body to recover. We won't have the tools for our muscle to build and repair. Therefore, we're probably gonna have a pretty poor body composition. So we wanna make sure that we're getting, on the macro level, we are getting 1 gram per pound of body weight. And although this is something that we all hear way too much, this is something that over and over is being proven to be very, very effective. Now, with the remaining macro, I generally recommend as an easy starting point that women drink 2 to 2.5 liters of water a day, men drink 2.5 to 3 liters of water per day. I'm sorry that's in metric, but metric's the way we should all be thinking because it actually makes sense. And that's what the scientific community uses, except this pounds is not metric, so that's life. But those two areas are going to make a massive difference on body composition. How much fat and carbs should you take in? I believe personally this varies for people on a multitude of issues. It can be ethnicity, it can be your background, it can be what you've acclimatized to. There can be so many things. Some people do really well with high carbohydrate diets. Some people don't. Some people do really well with low carb diets. Some people don't. It's a bit of playing with what works for you. But the reality is most people work with moderate levels of both. So the way I would structure it initially is I would start with that 1 pound or 1 gram per pound of body weight for protein. Look at how many calories you've used up on that, and then split up the rest between protein and carbs. And I would probably go that remainder, probably about 60% carbs, 40% fat. Then your micronutrients. Now the micronutrients is our vitamins and minerals. This is going to dictate cellular health. This is going to dictate how healthy your body is. You can be getting the perfect macronutrient breakdown, but you can be getting through absolute shit food that has no micronutrient value, which means you are going to fail and break somewhere. That can be cognitive decline, that can be heart issues, that can be just joint issues, that can be a multitude of things. But fundamentally, cellular function is controlled by our micronutrients. We need to make sure we keep those in check. The next is our sleep. Sleep is a very tricky one because very few people have the luxury of sleeping a lot. But I would recommend 7 to 9 hours per night. 9 is going to be extremely unrealistic for most people. 7 may be doable for most. This usually means getting up earlier. You've got to get out of the rut. Like this staying up till 11:30 at night with Netflix bullshit, that's just not gonna help. And sometimes when people have busy home lives and kids, that's the only time they get together. The reality is you're going to have to start spacing that out, or maybe you only stay up later and watch Tuesdays or Tuesday, Thursdays, or on the weekends. But overall, getting those 7 hours of sleep. Now, fitting this all in, many of my clients end up getting up early. I have a lot of clients who get up at 4:30 or get up at 5 a.m. and go and train, and that's the time, because then you know what's gonna happen. Then once you train, you go to work, you come home, and you can be with your family or be a part of whatever else you wanna be a part of. That is going to be very, very important. Now, when we talk about training, we're not gonna break down the training actual blocks in too much, but we're just gonna look at specific training variables that we want to train and the order we wanna train them. The very first variable that you want to train is strength. And when I talk about strength, I'm talking about global strength. You want to make sure that you have fundamental strength in your squats, in your split squat movements, in your push and pull. Now, this seems very rudimentary, but these motions become the basis of almost everything we do. So from a strength point of view, you want to get strong, and with this, you want to increase your range of motion, which goes into mobility. So generally what I'll do is I will develop a strength standard for a set range of motion that I want someone to hit. Let's say it's being able to squat X amount of weight. Let's say it's their body weight for 10 reps to parallel. And then we will start increasing that mobility either with that lift or with accessory work. Remember, mobility is not just simply stretching your body out. Mobility is creating length and strength in the muscle. The biggest mistake people make when training mobility is they do static stretches on repeat. Static stretches have their place, but that is not how you ultimately create resilience. We need to be strong through those increased range of motion, and just pulling on a muscle that we try to more or less turn off is not going to create that. We need to create length and we need to create strength throughout that. So a really good example would be we start off and we squat, if this is our squatter, we squat to parallel if that's the hip line. And then as we progress, we get deeper and deeper, and then eventually our squat looks like this, and we're getting full knee flexion and full hip flexion. That would be a really easy example of creating depth on your squat or creating mobility. Now this will be assisted by static stretching. And static stretching is very useful, and I do have most of my clients do variations of static stretching, especially for specific areas or to open up pathways that are just too tight to get into. As we progress, mobility and static stretching start blending in quite a bit because we start learning how to keep tension on the muscle and essentially load the muscle even if there's no weight involved, which our stretching and mobility become one. While we're doing this, we want to also focus on zone 2 health. Zone 2, we call that aerobic health. Essentially, that's about 70% of our max heart rate. We want to spend a lot of our time, and if you're an endurance athlete, you probably want to spend around 80% of your energy in zone 2. A really easy way to judge this is you can hold a conversation while you're doing this. If you are not in great shape, zone 2 is extremely challenging because you will get kicked out of zone 2 really easily, meaning your conditioning is poor, so almost anything you do will elevate your heart rate more than that and put your body out of a zone 2 into a zone 3 or 4 quite easily. Now, the next two qualities are going to be anaerobic, which would come either simultaneously depending on where you're at or after you've developed a zone 2 base. So anaerobic conditioning Actually, let's make it simpler. Let's call it VO2 max via anaerobic work. And what this means is this is high intensity work. So next we want to have our high intensity work. This should make up around 20% of our conditioning, which by default makes sense because this is going to be harder on our bodies to sustain. This is also going to be harder on our nervous system, and it's going to take more time to recover from. The final is plyometric and power work. Now, these qualities will be simultaneously developed, but we want to make sure we have a proper strength base before we get into any power work. We want to make sure we have great mobility before we start getting into explosive movements on the strength phase. We want to make sure that we have a basic aerobic base before we get into high intensity training. Now, these things, it can sound a little bit ambiguous because nothing occurs in a silo with our body. Meaning, if we train just hypertrophy like a bodybuilder, we're still getting stronger and we're still developing a little bit more power. If we develop strictly power, we're still gonna get stronger, and we still, especially in the early stages, may get a little bit of hypertrophy. Now, as we go with our training, and this is the key thing, one of the key things that distinguishes between the way you train when you're young and the way you train when you're old. Now, and what I'm gonna say here is undulations, is understanding that you cannot peak very often. Now, if you worked with a great trainer when you were younger, or you were part of a great collegiate program, then they probably understood this and they probably acted accordingly. But when you train, if we go volume on the bottom and on the y-axis we go intensity, we cannot perpetually do this. If we perpetually do this, eventually we break. A really easy example of this is someone who's doing what we call linear periodization, where you go 10 reps and you just keep pushing, and every week you do 4x10 and you get heavier and heavier and heavier, and you start maxing out, and then eventually you hit a wall and you keep trying to hit the same weight and you keep maxing out, and you either plateau or you get injured. What we really need to understand is when we get into that into that training, we need to really focus on training in a very smart way, like an elite athlete would, but also in a slightly scaled back way. Which means if this is our max intensity, we don't want to touch this very often. We want to spend a lot of time in that 70% range, maybe 80% range. On certain blocks, we might go from a 6 to a 9 out of 10 as we ramp up, and then we'll pull right back down. Very rarely do we hit this ceiling. So often we will look, and as the intensity goes up, actually, this will be confusing. Often we will see as the intensity goes up, the volume will go down, right? The volume will have to go up. This is very, very simple. But how high we go, for an elite athlete, you will end up hitting 100% more often. For an adult athlete, we want to make our ceiling more like a 90%. And we want to spend most of our time between 60 and 80% in there. A really important thing to understand is that our relationship between joint health and movement has to be very focused on. We can't just beat ourselves down. We need to make sure that our movements are the way they should be, but also we want to make sure that if something isn't working, we have to evolve it, because we don't have the ability to always overcome those things. For example, if we're on a big squat block and things are going great and we're someone who wants to push our squat, but all of a sudden it starts breaking down, we may have to stop squatting completely and go to unilateral work for 2, 4, 6, maybe 8 or 10 weeks and sacrifice that because we don't even want to get in a little bit of a zone of danger. We don't want to risk that. Okay, it's also really important that you're thinking long-term, because now when you're 20, 25, it feels like everything's happening right in front of you. When you're an older athlete, you realize that your goals are now 6 to 12 months out and sometimes 5 to 10 years out. But I'm going to give you a very basic framework of how we script this with athletes and clients. Remember, I refer to all of my clients as athletes, even if they've never played a sport, because I believe that athleticism is the key to longevity. So we would look at it through this scale. We would have our macro goal, which is 6 to 12 months. We'd have our mesocycle goal, which is 4 to 8 weeks. So that would make up those. And then we have our micro, which is 1 week generally. Now what we do is we stack wins here. We stack 1 week wins that are all designed to build towards that win within that block, because our training blocks are usually 4 to 6 weeks. So if we stack these wins, we win that block. We win that block, we're one step closer to winning that year. Usually our year is going to be about 8 blocks, 6 to 8 blocks. We get through that and then we've accomplished our goal. Now we start going, what's our longer term goal? Maybe our long-term goal is to run an ultra marathon in 3 years. We just ran a 5K. We now start focusing on running a small volume every week. On this, every block we change to a larger distance. Our 6-month goal is to run a half marathon. Our 12-month is to run a full marathon, and then we build up from there. The key thing to remember when you're training as an adult is, number one, don't just throw stuff at the wall and see what fits or what sticks. If you do that, you're going to get into a situation where you start breaking and you wonder why you're not getting where you want. Now, even if you don't break down, the reality is you don't have a lot of free time. So when you take time that is already at a premium and you do things in a way that's not optimized, it's going to really get to you because you're going to be unhappy with your results. You're going to be stagnant in your mindset and you're really going to start second guessing if this is something you want to do. So make sure that you are part of something that supports what your lifestyle and goals are and start breaking it down and thinking long term. If you need more support, if you want to know a little bit more about how this works, hit the link below, book a call, and we'll chat. I'm Jim Deal. Thanks for your time.